Hi, I'm Tony. Welcome to So Lounge. Today we are going to be working with McCall's 8031 and we are going to be attaching the facing to the front part of the dress and finishing the collar once and for all. So Lounge is the place for beginners to learn to sew one pattern at a time. Be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. So first things first, I have not attached the inner facing to the actual facing, and that is going to give the facing a little bit more stability. Once we go in and put in those buttonholes, it's going to keep them crisp and it's going to be easier to put them in with the inner facing on the back of the actual facing. So that's what we're going to do first. That is not part of the instructions. It is, but not part of the part we're working on. So that's at the beginning of the instructions to attach your inner facing to all of your pieces. For some reason, I just don't ever do it at the beginning. I do it as I work with each piece. So that's just my personal method. You can do it however you want. So if you haven't attached the inner facing, that is what we are going to do first. Let's head over to the ironing board. I'm at the ironing board and I am ready to attach my interfacing to my facing. So this is piece number 9. You should have cut 2 of these in fabric and 2 of these in interfacing. Now remember, we marked the pattern pieces and I'm going to need to know where these marks are for stitching. So I am going to attach the interfacing to the side that does not have marks on it. That way I'll still be able to see those once I start sewing and putting things together. Now, I'm using black interfacing because I'm using a dark colored fabric. By using the black interfacing, it is not going to show through and be lighter. If I use white interfacing, it would be lighter than the rest of the dress, and I don't want to do that. So I have my piece, and I'm just matching the piece of the interfacing, and apparently I didn't cut this well enough. So just follow the instructions for the interfacing layout of the pattern. It is right after the fabric layout for cutting, so just follow the same thing for the interfacing. Like I said, I just cut mine out later, so no worries. When you are attaching interfacing, you want the scratchy side with the little adhesive dots to go against whatever side of the fabric you are attaching it to. So this is going to be the inside of my facing, and that's the side that I want to attach the interfacing to. So I am going to just get it all lined up, and you may have noticed that my interfacing is a little bit wrinkled. That is not a problem. Interfacing will straighten itself out once we start attaching it to the fabric, so you do not have to worry about that. Do not iron interfacing ahead of time because it will stick to itself, and that kind of defeats the entire purpose. There is a notch here on the front of my facing, so that's where I'm going to start. I'm just going to press. As mentioned previously, iron-in interfacing is not to be ironed, it's to be pressed. If you iron it, it will disintegrate or it will rumple up on whatever you're attaching to and not be nice and smooth, and it looks horrible. So don't do that. So I am just going along the interfacing side of the facing, going up to the neckline where there's another notch. And I have steam on my iron. It is lower steam than normal for cotton. It's kind of bunching right here, so I'm going to just straighten that out. It's not lining up. Okay. I think we can figure that out. Okay, so I'm just going to apply some steam. Get that to all adhere. Moving down, pressing, do not move your fabric and your interfacing while you were doing this. You want everything to cool completely, and you want to make sure that it's totally secure. So one way to know it's secure is that you can't see the little dots anymore, and it looks more opaque than previously. So repeat on the other side with your other piece, and then we'll head back to the cutting table. Now that we have our interfacing attached to our facings, we are ready to actually start the steps for attaching the facing to the dress. Now, if you're following along, we are starting with pattern instruction number 28. Let's go in for a closer look. Looking at pattern instruction number 28. The first thing we are going to do is stay stitch the neck edge of the front facing, that's piece number 9, a 1/2 inch from the raw edge between the large circle and the triangle. So that's one reason why we needed to make sure we kept these marks on our pattern piece, because that's where we're going to be sewing from the circle up to the shoulder of the triangle. And we are going to be doing some stay stitching. Now, the next step says to finish the inner edge of the facing using one of the methods described under finishing seams and raw edges. So we want to go to the other page, the first page of the instructions, and take a look at what it says about finishing seams and raw edges. Now, these are some different methods you can use to finish your seam. The first one is going to be pinking, using pinking shears, and that's cutting it so that it's a little zigzag. Second is going to be just stitching a zigzag stitch along the edge of the facing. Next would be the option to stitch 1/4 inch from the raw edge, then turn it under, stitch again, and the fourth method would be using a serger. Now, we are going to go with method number 2. Since the facing has interfacing attached, even though my fabric's ravelly, we're going to go with that one because that's going to be the easiest one to do. Most people don't have sergers. We are not going to do number 1 with the pinking shears because this fabric is very ravelly, and that is not going to help the situation. That will only make it worse. So let's keep going. Moving down, after we have finished the inside edge, then we are going to turn in the seam allowance on the shoulder 5/8 of an inch, and that's going to be shown in this little diagram here. Then we're going to press, and then we are going to go pin the facing to the front opening as shown in this diagram and attach it. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to catch the collar in there in the facing and then come back down the other side, and that will attach everything together. That will permanently attach our collar to the neck edge. And then we are going to do some clipping over here, which is shown in this diagram. It will make more sense once we get to that point. And then we will turn all the facings to the inside. We will press everything, and we will slip stitch that collar closed. So this is the whole reason why we left that piece of the collar open, because we're going to flip it over, stitch it all nice along the inside neckline, and then we will be finished. We are back at the sewing machine, and make sure that your stitch length has been reset from the basting stitch if your machine does not automatically reset when you turn it off. So we were putting on the collar with a basting stitch. We need to just have a regular stitch length, whatever that is for you. For me, it's 2.5. We need to reset our machine for that, and we're going to do some stay stitching, which is just a regular length stitch. It is going to be sewn inside of the seam line, so we are going to be stitching at a 1/2 inch, and we're going to be stitching between the circle and the triangle, going up around that neck edge. Let's go in for a closer look. All right, so we are ready to do some stay stitching. We are going to sew at a 1/2 inch, so I have my magnetic seam gauge all lined up and ready to go. And just line up the facing so that you are sewing between the circle and the triangle. Let's lower that presser foot. And I'm starting just kind of even with the circle. So let's start stitching, and we're just going to work our way around. And stop at that triangle. Cut off your threads. Maybe not. There we go. And that is what your stay stitching should look like. Repeat on the other side. Now that the stay stitching is in place, the next step is to finish the edge. Now the edge we're finishing is going to be this outside edge, which is slightly curved. That's going to be the side that's just going to be loose. It's not going to be attached to anything. We're going to be sewing the facing to the dress along this front edge. That's why there is a notch here. So we're going to be doing a zigzag stitch, and we're just going to do it close to the edge. So it does not matter which piece you start with, but sew from which side you start with, but start from the top shoulder edge and work down. So we can sew from the interfacing on one side, actual fabric on the other, get this done and not have to worry about it. When you are picking a zigzag stitch for your fabric, take a little scrap piece and practice sewing a zigzag stitch so you can adjust accordingly. Remember, with a zigzag stitch, you have to adjust the length and the width to get a nice, even, tight zigzag to actually finish this edge and keep it together once you wash your fabric. So let's go in for a closer look. So this is my little sample stitch. This is a 2.5 length and a 3 width. I just did it one side and I did add interfacing to the back of this so I would have a good gauge of what it would actually look like. That was my first pass, and then I did it again closer to the edge of my fabric. So that is what we are going to be going with for finishing the edge of the facing. Now, you can sew from either side, as mentioned, but we want to line up at pretty close to the edge, but not totally at the edge because it is going to zigzag. So I kind of have my facing halfway between, or kind of in the middle of my presser foot. So you can kind of see that it's in the middle of that presser foot right there. And I have the rest of it on my lap so it's not pulling. And I'm just going to keep that lined up and start with the zigzag stitch. So we're just coming to the other end, and I'm going to lift my needle, then lift my presser foot and cut off these thread tails. And now you can see that we have that edge of the facing. It is all finished and it will hold up during wash and wear. So just repeat on the other facing and then we'll move on to the next step. We're at the ironing board and now we're moving on to step number 29, which is folding the shoulder seam 5/8 of an inch towards the side with the interfacing, and then we're going to press. So you can use a hem gauge, mark it at 5/8 of an inch, or you can use a Dritz Easy Hem if you have one of those. It also has the 5/8 inch marking. So make sure that your iron is set appropriately for your fabric, and then we are just going to press that edge to fold it down, and this is going to help with the process of attaching the facing to the shoulder seams where the collar is. So this is kind of the part that gets a little complicated, or it's not that complicated. We're going to work through it, but this is a prep that you need to do before we get to that part, which is a little bit later. So just repeat on the other facing. So we're at step number 30, and the first sentence says to pin the facing to the front opening and neck edges, matching the symbols and notches. So we are pinning it to the right side of the garment. That's going to be the side that has the pockets on it. And we want the interfacing side to be folded out, because what we're going to do is flip this all to the inside, and that is the way to achieve that. So there is a notch on the front of the facing. Oh, that's the wrong side. Make sure you have the right side. So the notch is on the front of the facing. That is what we are going to start with and line up on the front edge of the dress. I'm going to put in a pin. And then I'm going to move up to the neckline. And remember, we still had that dot and some other markings, the triangle. So that is what we are going to get matched up with this front piece. Now, one thing to also keep in mind is if you move to the next sentence of the instructions, it says clip the front facing between the stay stitching as needed. So you may be wondering, why would I need to do that? Because you want everything to match up, and because this is a curve. Sometimes it needs a little extra help. So we put that back to make sure that everything lines. Let's go in for a closer look. This is just a close-up view of the facing pinned to the front of the dress, so we can see the pocket. That's the nice front of the pocket. We have our notch matched here, and then I have gone down the entire front and pinned the front along that front edge. Now the next thing we're doing is we are matching the circle here on the facing to our original circle mark that is here where our collar ends on our dress front. So that is what we need to get all lined up. You can, let's go in a little bit closer. There we go. So you can see the chalk dot. We just kind of line them all up together, put in a pin there. Now I'm not going to pin this edge because if you keep reading the instructions, it says to stitch stretching the front between the large circle and the notch on the front. So we've got to stretch this as we sew it to make it fit. And because of that, we're not going to pin it. We'll just work it out when we get to it. If you move around, the next mark we are matching is going to be the triangle, which is here, to the triangle that is on that shoulder seam. And when you get those all lined up, you may notice that this isn't lying nice and smooth. This is why we are going to clip the facing down to the stay stitching so that we can make it fit to this curve of the collar and the neckline. So I am just going to clip down towards that stay stitching line. I'm just going to put in about 3. That should do it. And now we're going to go back, and if we line everything up, we can now bend that seam to make it all match, and that's what we want while we are sewing. So put a pin in at that triangle and then go back in and fit the curve of the facing to the curve of the dress with the attached collar. So you can put in a pin in there. It's going to be kind of chunky, don't worry about it. We'll fix that later. And then when you go around the neckline, so make sure you pin both sides and trim down to these stay stitching. Then the other part that's important is to make sure that this still stays free, because we're going to go in and stitch all of this in, and we want to make sure that this is still loose, so once we flip, we can stay stitch that in place by hand. Now that the facing is pinned to the main part of the dress, we are going to go in and we are going to attach those pieces all together and keep going on. Now this is going to be step number 30. It's still step number 30. We have pinned everything, so now we are going to go into the stitching. We are just doing a straight stitch. So if you used your zigzag stitch to finish your facing edge, make sure you reset your machine so you are not starting out with the wrong kind of stitch. And mine is clear. Let me turn this off actually because that's not moving. There we go. Okay, so I have my regular stitch length of 2.5. I'm going to be sewing a straight stitch. We are going to start at the bottom of the facing, and then we're going to go up and around and come down the other side. So just to get everything lined up, it's a lot to get situated. So take your time, make sure everything is nice and smooth, and then we are going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch. So I've got my handy gauge. I'm going to measure 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to use my magnetic seam gauge to get everything lined up so that I can stay on track. Now I'm just going to get started here. Let's go in for a closer look. So I did not show you the first straight part, but that is what I've been sewing, and we are now coming up to the notch on the front facing that is matched up with the notch on the front edge of the dress. Now this is where we need to start pulling and stretching. So we're going to pull this piece to stretch to fit the dress piece underneath. So just get everything lined up, do your best. This is kind of a weird thing to have to do. It feels kind of weird while you're sewing. So okay, now I'm going to start pulling. It's going to be pretty close. My fabric is also a little stretchy, so that's helping the situation. So I am just going to be holding this edge down here as I'm pulling, keeping everything lined up at 5/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to slow down and stop because at this point I want to pivot my needle and the presser foot, and we're going to do that at 5/8 of an inch. So let's measure 5/8 of an inch with our trusty measuring gauge. And I'm just going to draw a line with a chalk pencil across there so I know, oops. So I know where I need to pivot. Let's go in a little bit closer so you can see that a little bit better. There you go. So I'm just going to keep stitching. You can see that it's all matching up there. I'm going to keep stitching. And then once I get to that line, I'm going to lift my presser foot, keeping my needle down. Oh, it needs to go a tiny bit further. There we go. So I'm going to lift my presser foot, keeping my needle down, and then I'm going to swing this part out and around to get it lined up against the 5/8 inch mark. So now we are coming up around the collar section. Make sure you lower your presser foot again because you don't want to start stitching and get out of place. So we're coming around the corner and going around the neckline. Just remove each pin as you get to it. And you want to make sure everything is staying lined up. That's why we clipped those seams. You move a pin. And now we're coming up to the shoulder mark. And then this is the tricky part again, where we are going to have to pull back the collar so that we just are stitching the under collar with the interfacing that you can still see. So I'm going to pull this back here. Try not to catch that as much as possible. And I'm still stitching at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so you may want to slow it down. It's stressing you out a little bit. I'm going to just smooth the rest of my yoke over to the side. And I'm going to hold this here with my finger. You can see there's another pin. That's where that triangle mark is on the shoulder. I'm just going to hold that, because it's going to be complicated enough trying to stitch over all of these different points. So still staying at 5/8 of an inch. And we're going through this bit that's fairly chunky, so don't worry about it. And then we're going to pull out this pin and keep going, repeating the process of stretching once we get down to this corner. And we're now just coming down to the other edge. You can see that I cut my facing too short because it's not matching up, but it's the same on both sides, so no worries. We're just going to finish that stitch and then lift the needle and the presser foot, cut off those thread tails, and now our facing is attached to our dress. By now, you should be done with step number 30. Your facing should be attached to the dress, and hopefully you didn't accidentally sew part of the yoke into this collar seam while you were sewing. That's what I did. I had to go in and rip it out. And no worries if you did, just rip it out, start again. You may want to add some pins through this section and make sure that your fabric is really nice and smooth underneath it so that you don't do what I did. Moving on to step number 31, and this is the one that's kind of confusing. If you read it in advance, you may be going like, I have no idea what this means. So we are going to look at the diagram, and then we're going to look at our dress and work it out together. Let's go in for a closer look. We are moving on to step number 31, which is to clip the neck and undercollar seam allowances at the ends of facings as shown. So then we're presented with this diagram, which is kind of hard to figure out what we're looking at and what is going on. The trick is that this is post clipping, so it's a little confusing to figure this out, but we are going to walk through this together. So this is the shoulder seam of the right panel of the dress. So the pocket should be there on the right. That is what we're looking at. So this is the same as in the diagram pre-clipping. So the diagram is post-clipping. What they want us to do is clip here so that then we can fold the seam allowance up into the collar, and we'll be folding the facing back around to the shoulder seam to tack it, and that will finish this whole edge through this part. So we are going to have everything together. This is the part that we do not want to clip. So that's shown as like the part coming down. And then we want to clip here. So I'm going to grab my shears, oops, and I'm going to clip next to the facing. Do not cut the stitch line, okay? And then these are free. So that's what the picture is showing us. You can see how now you can kind of figure out what's going on a little bit better. So that is what we have there. Now it's free. We are going to go in and press this towards the collar. So that whole seam is going to get pressed to the collar. Then we are going to pull the under collar out, and we are going to flip this facing towards the inside to attach it to that shoulder seam with some slip stitching. So first we need to trim the seams. So we're going to trim out these seam allowances just a little bit. I'm not going to go crazy. That is the next part of 31. I'm trimming them off about, I'd say from the actual seam line, it's 1/4 of an inch. So you don't have to take a whole lot out. We just want to reduce some of this bulk. So I'm going to just cut that all out of this section of the collar. And then once I get to the other side, I'm going to repeat the process. So it's just really clipping down to the stitch line here. And then I'm going to clip over and finish trimming out that seam. Move that out of the way. So now you can see that it's a smaller seam allowance. We're going to press that in towards the under collar, and then we're going to restitch on top by hand to finish that out, and that'll be the inside of the collar. That'll be the outside of the collar, but you can kind of see a little bit better what is happening now that it's explained. So once you have carefully clipped that seam and then trimmed the seam allowance between this collar part, we still need to go trim out the bulk of this seam in the rest of the front of the garment, which is still the collar, the facing, and the inside of the dress. So I'm just going to continue to trim that at the same, about 1/4 of an inch from that stitch line, and to just reduce the bulk before we turn the facing to the inside of the garment and then tack it down in place. So the other thing you want to do is there is going to be a corner here. You do want to trim out the seam allowance in this area. It's a little easier to see. So you want to trim this out in this area so that then you have a nice little point. And then we will move on to step number 32, which is going to be flipping the facings to the right side and pressing and then doing some hand stitching. So once you're finished trimming, we'll move on to the next step. Finishing up step number 31, we are going to press the seam allowance towards the under collar, and then we will flip that little top piece of the upper collar over to cover it up. We're going to be creating an enclosed seam there. So just use some steam, get that going in the right direction, let it cool, and then we're just going to fold over that top piece to just cover it up for now. Now, the next step, if we move down to step number 32, is to fold the facings right side or inside out. So we're flipping the facings so that then they're all on the inside of the garment. They're currently on the outside of the garment. But one thing they do not mention is to trim your seams. Now, I don't know if they're assuming you're going to do this, but I figure it's worth it to point out this point in time. You definitely need to trim that little corner of the facing because that is going to be that little notch detail on the collar once we get to that point. So make sure you trim that out. And then the other thing I would suggest is to press the seam allowance towards the facing side of the garment down the whole front panel. Because once we go back in and flip that and then press it again, it'll just be a nice crisp edge that will be ready for us to add in the buttonholes later down the line. It's also going to be easier to turn your facing once you have pressed the seam allowance towards the side of the facing. Now, be careful because you do have interfacing on this. You do not want to destroy it. So do not push your iron around on top. Just press along that seam, lift and move it down, and then once you have that all finished, we'll turn the facings to the inside of the garment. Now that your seam allowance is pressed up towards the facing, we are at the point to move to step 32 and turn the facings to the inside of the garment. So as you're doing that, you want to grab a point turner of some sort to poke out this little corner here of the front edge of the facing. That's going to look like the little collar notch, but it's not actually part of the collar, it's part of the facing. So just do that carefully so you get a nice little point. And then continue to just flip your facing, and I'm going to press again from the right side of the garment. So the facing is down against the table. I'm just going to press along this edge to just get all of my fabric set, and then we will have a nice crisp edge once we move on to the next step. And so pressing the seam towards the facing helped with that. And now this is going to help again, just keeping that nice edge. I need to push it back a little bit. There we go. And it's also going to help finish that little point. So once you have done that, repeat it on the other side. And then on the inside, you want to make sure that the facing is going towards the shoulder seam. So the shoulder seam's here. We want the facing to be attached to the shoulder seam. So I'm going to give it another little press along this neck edge to just get that kind of going in place, and it's just going to make everything look nice and neat once we go in and do some hand stitching. The last step of instruction number 32 is to do some slip stitching by hand. We will slip stitch to attach the facing to the shoulder seam, and then also to attach the upper collar to the under collar to cover up that seam that we pressed. Now, I'm not going to show you how to do that in this video because I have made 2 other videos which have the very same information, and this video is getting a little bit long. So you can head to How to Tack Facings, which will walk you step by step through tacking facings to a skirt. It's the exact same thing you can use for the shoulder seam. And then there's also a video on how to use a thimble if you want to learn how to do that. And that will be very helpful for the same thing. So you can check out either of those videos. They will help you do some hand sewing and teach you how to use a thimble in the meantime. Now you know how to sew a facing, and you kind of know what the purpose of a facing is. So we have finished this edge on the front of the dress. That's going to be reinforced with the interfacing for buttonholes that are coming up soon. And then you can also see that the facing has made this additional point collar kind of detail that's not actually part of the collar. So different ways to use a facing, and hopefully you have enjoyed this video. So be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. Coming up, we will be doing a sleeve for this dress. We will be making some buttonholes and putting in a hem, so stay tuned. If you've got questions but no one to answer them, head on over to Let's Talk Sewing for Beginners, hosted by Sew Lounge. It's an interactive Facebook group where you can ask all the questions you want and I will get you some answers. Just click the link in the description for this video and sign up. Until we meet again, happy sewing!